Tonight we have a very interesting speaker. Zach Foster is a historian with an endless passion for local history and lore. He earned his BA in political science from Cal Poly Pomona and currently works as a cultural interpreter and linguist and is a former reserve soldier. Zach is the author of the upcoming book, The Confederate Territory of Arizona, and for the past 2 years he's also the man behind the YouTube channel The Civil War Wild West Edition, which follows the war between the states and the territories from Oregon to Texas. So please welcome our speaker tonight, Zach Foster.
Thank you very much, everybody, for coming tonight. This is my home group. The Pasadena Civil War Roundtable was the very first of any roundtable meetings that I ever attended, so it's very special for me to be able to come here and share some of these cool true stories with you. Before anything else, before I say a word about anybody, I want to read this letter to you to give you an idea of what was happening right here in Southern California. This letter was written in San Bernardino from a newspaper man named Ed Sherman, and he is writing this to Major James Carleton, who was the ranking U.S. Army officer in Southern California and who would eventually command the Union Army expedition to push the Confederate Army out of Arizona. This letter, written in San Bernardino, is dated July 27, 1861. Dear Sir, in response to your request and giving an account of the state of affairs in this and the adjoining counties, I herewith comply by giving in detail what has passed under my own observation, and also the information given me by responsible persons during the last 3 months. I was informed by Mr. James Leonard of this city that the American population of Santa Ana and other settlements were excited about something and their actions were strange. Some Americans had been endeavoring to raise recruits among them for the South, among which was a man by the name of Jordan who had been the most active. Secret meetings were being held, and the indications were that some extraordinary movement was about to take place. I thought it was time that something should be done in order to distinguish friends from foes. A public meeting was called for the purpose of organizing a Union Club and to bring the matter to a close test. After some debate, those who claimed to be Union men adopted resolutions, and others who were opposed sat in sullen silence. Simultaneously with these proceedings, the bear flag was raised in the Monte, he's talking about El Monte, and threats were made that a descent would be made upon this place. The club continued to meet about twice a week, gradually dwindling away in numbers, and finally it was impossible to get them to meet at all. An unaccountable fear or dread seemed to pervade the community. Rowdyism and drunkenness, shootings in the street, hurrahing for Jeff Davis, and all sort of outrages were being continually committed, and no person was safe in the streets after dark. I received information that an attempt would shortly be made by secessionists to destroy my press. We gathered some 5 or 6 Union men together and organized a club, now numbering 16 in all, one of whom has since proved to be a traitor. Relying on this club as my only protection, we prepared ourselves for defense. I was soon informed that a dentist by the name of Dr. Shrewsbury in the county, and especially up in the mines, in circulating the paper and obtaining signatures of secessionists who were to act in concert with those in El Monte, pledging themselves to destroy my press. Of this, I was informed by a Freemason. I have been also informed by a man by the name of Baldwin that a Mr. Hathaway and some others came up from El Monte with the avowed intention of drawing me into a difficulty and forcing me to act on the defense and then take my life. Mr. Baldwin overheard their conversation in his house and immediately gave me friendly warning. I visited Holcomb Valley on the 21st of the present month. I there learned from the best authority that the secessionists had for a long time previous to this 4th of July held a rod of terror over the Union men, threatening them in every manner possible, and it had been unsafe for Union men to express their opinion. I also learned that Mayor Marcia Salt of Los Angeles had been up there in company with Captain Alonzo Ridley for the purpose of obtaining recruits for the secession. Both money and official position was promised, and a Dr. Hogue, a Mr. Hopkins, and Dr. Shrewsbury had been very busy in this matter. A difficulty took place in a disreputable house, and shots were fired. One man was killed, and several were wounded. Drs. Hogue and Shrewsbury were among the party. They are both very bad men. I have been informed that they have already received commissions in the rebellion army. A Mr. Hopkins and Dr. Shrewsbury met a gentleman by the name of J.L. Ware in company with another, whose name is Joseph Caldwell. Mr. Ware offered a drink of spirits to Mr. Hopkins, who offered a toast to the health of Jeff Davis. Ware immediately snatched the bottle from his lips and dashed it against a rock and started on, when Hopkins said to Shrewsbury, "As we have got to begin somewhere pretty soon, we may as well begin with him." They started in pursuit of Ware, who saw them coming with their revolvers drawn in a threatening manner, immediately dismounted from his horse and loaded his rifle and prepared to receive them. When they saw this, they turned and remarked that they would let him go this time, but the next time they would have his life, as well as every other Union man's, before long. On the 4th of July, the Union men were threatened that if they raised the American flag, they would be shot down. About 100 Union men armed themselves and assembled at Don Luis Barcino's house, raised a liberty pole, and hoisted the Stars and Stripes. Several secessionists made their appearance, but seeing the determined attitude of the Union men, they immediately left. The Union men throughout the mines took courage, and many have come out and declared their sentiments. They fear no open attack now, but every prominent Union man is in danger of a secret assassination when traveling alone on the different mountain trails. There are about 1,000 men in the mines, though widely scattered. Fully 1/3 are openly declared secessionists, and probably 2/5 are neutral, the balance Union men. In the valley, 2/5 are secessionists, 1/5 positively declared neutral men, the balance Union men, yet nearly all leaving room for doubt. As a criterion to judge by, out of a population in the valley of over 1,500 persons, of which there are 500 or 600 voters, I have not over 50 subscribers to my pro-Union newspaper, and of 1,000 miners in Holcomb Valley, I have only about 40 subscribers. I would say that if troops were sent to this area, not only the Union sentiment would be strengthened, but martial law could be proclaimed, and we would have protection to our persons, but also our property. It is my candid opinion that if at least one company of Union troops were stationed here in San Bernardino, it would be of great benefit to the Union men of this section. Yours truly, Edwin A. Sherman, editor of the San Bernardino Weekly Patriot. That was the situation in Southern California in July of 1861. So that begs the question, what happened? How did we get here that people are already killing each other over politics in the streets? Well, I'll tell you the story. I'm Zach Foster, and tonight I'm going to share with you some research that I've been doing in part for the advancement of history in Southern California, and also in part to write some documentaries for my YouTube channel, The Civil War Wild West Edition, which tells incredible true stories from the war between the states and territories west of the Mississippi River. So, let's go back in time about 2 years. Let's go back to 1859. The gentlemen we're looking here are two very high-ranking politicians. On the left, we have David Terry. Up until mid-1859, he was the Chief Justice of the California Supreme Court. And on the right is David Broderick. He was California's junior-ranking U.S. Senator. Mr. Terry was born in Virginia, raised in Texas. His family and fortune were out in Texas when the war began. Whereas Senator Broderick did not come from old money like Judge Terry, Senator Broderick was a self-made man. He was new money. He was born and raised in New York, and he was the son of Irish immigrants. Both of these politicians were members of the Democrat Party in the early 1850s, but then the sectional crisis from the East Coast drifted over to some of the new territories like Kansas, and then it continued drifting farther west until in 1859, the slavery issue had divided the Democrat Party nationwide, also in California. Now, Justice Terry and Senator Broderick already hated each other on a personal level before the sectional crisis got involved, but with the sectional crisis happening and with people killing each other all over America, well, the other shoe was going to drop in California, and it did. The excuse used was differences in politics, but really it was personal differences. One of Justice Terry's friends overheard Senator Broderick saying terrible personal remarks about Justice Terry at a bar, at a tavern, and then the word got back to Justice Terry, and he challenged the senator to a duel. So one day in 1859, somewhere at the edge of San Mateo County, Justice Terry, who had resigned his position in the California Supreme Court, the day before, and Senator Broderick, who had no intention of resigning from the United States Senate, met on the San Mateo County line. They picked their pistols out. They had their seconds with them, their little entourages. They marched several paces apart. The count was made, and Senator Broderick did not know that these particular pistols had hair triggers. So, while they were being called to aim their guns, he was still raising his pistol when it discharged into the ground, and the bullet fell harmlessly somewhere near Justice Terry's feet. The judge still got his shot, so he took a well-aimed shot, fired, and the bullet landed in Senator Broderick's chest. He staggered, he fell down to one knee, he apologized to his entourage that he could not continue, and right there he collapsed. He was taken away by his entourage, who were desperately searching for a doctor, and for the next 3 days, Senator Broderick tried to cling to life. He was in excruciating and agonizing pain, and he eventually died from his wounds. Bleeding Kansas had come to California. The other thing that was happening in 1859 was the passage of the PICO Act. So, the California Democrat Party was divided, and this is the issue that officially divided it. There was strong support in the state legislature and across the state's voters for dividing the free state of California into two states. The northern part would be the state of California, and then the southern part would be the Colorado Territory, because the Colorado that we're thinking about didn't exist for another 2 years, and within a year or two, Colorado was going to be a state as well. Southern California, or excuse me, Colorado was going to be a slaveholding territory and then a slave state. This actually passed through the legislature and was ratified by the voters, but it did not make it out of Congress because by 1860, the sectional crisis was already happening. John Brown had done his thing in Kansas and Virginia. He got caught, he'd gotten executed, and there was just so much chaos happening that nobody in Congress was even going to let the bill out of committee. That's why California was still one state when the Civil War began. Now, if you've been to the Drum Barrack Civil War Museum, or if you've read anything about California during the 1850s, it was officially a free state, and it did cause brouhaha in the United States Congress because officially the admission of California into the Union as the 35th state, notice 35 is not an even number, tilted the balance between free states and slave states as far as congressional reputation. But it doesn't tell you the whole story, because it turns out most of California's congressmen and senators, and a pretty good chunk of the state assembly and the state senate, acknowledged that California was going to be a free state, but they were all pro-slavery people. They were pro-slavery Democrats. So for example, William Gwynn, California's senior ranking senator, he was a Mississippi planter. He still had a plantation and slaves in Mississippi. Every once in a while, he would bring his slaves from Mississippi to California. And one of the technicalities that some of the slave owners in California did to get around that law was they would spend as much time in California as they needed to spend, get their business done, and then they would go back to their home state for a few months so that they could have their slaves still in the state of residency where they were registered as property, because obviously these slaves were not registered as property in California. Can't do that here. But if they were registered as property in Mississippi and they were not in California for a full 12 months, well, they were still considered property. And because of the fugitive slave law, which was part of the compromise that was necessary for California to enter the Union as a free state, you could have your slave in California for a few months. And there were several instances where runaway slaves in California were captured by slave catchers, and they were sent back to their masters east of the Mississippi River. That's why court cases like the Biddy Mason case were such landmark court cases, because that was the first time that ex-slaves had actual hope that they could stay in a free state without the fear of having to be deported. So what else happened in 1859? Well, the PICO Act passed, but it did not make it out of Congress. 1860, the election crisis happens, and then Abraham Lincoln just barely won the state of California by just under 700 votes. This was possible because the California Democrat Party was divided. It had dominated California politics throughout the 1850s, but because of the sectional crisis, the Democrat Party split into two parties who were at each other's throat. So if it had been one party, they would have absolutely annihilated the Republicans. Lincoln would not have made any gains in the states, but that's not the way it happens, because the pro-slavery Democrats and the anti-slavery Democrats were at each other's throats, and it cost them the election. On the right is the 1860 presidential electoral map of California, and you can see a couple of interesting things. This right here, this light green one, is Los Angeles County. It had a little bit more land to the north than it does today, but that was LA. You can recognize this coast. This blue county, the blue stands for Northern Democrats, so these are the counties that voted for Douglas. You can see mostly in the far northern part of the state, and then down here in Ventura County, whereas Los Angeles voted for John C. Breckinridge, and then over here in San Bernardino County, Abraham Lincoln won that county by the hair of his chinny chin chin. But that doesn't mean that it was necessarily a Republican county, because San Bernardino still elected a Northern Democrat to the state assembly, and there were a number of local politicians who were avowed secessionists who dominated their particular districts. So Abraham Lincoln barely won California, but as you can see with all those green counties, there were a lot of Southern sympathizers, and then when states started seceding, they wanted to go along as well. I have told you about the political duel in which Justice Terry, a pro-Southerner, killed Senator Broderick, a Northerner, but there was another political duel that happened in California in May of 1861, and this was by two members of the legislature. So this is a lovely illustration from my 1930s edition of the Los Angeles Times, going back and recounting the history of the Showalter duel. But the story is, Assemblyman Daniel Showalter, who was a Southern Democrat, born and raised in Pennsylvania, by the way, but he was a Southern Democrat. He was pro-Southern, pro-secession, challenged Assemblyman Charles Piercy to a duel. Charles Piercy was the Northern Democrat who was elected in San Bernardino. So that's already an incredible story right there. The state assemblyman from San Bernardino and the assemblyman from Mariposa County met somewhere out in the field in front of Lord Fairfax's house. Assemblyman Fairfax was another Southern Democrat in the state legislature, but because of his lineage going back to England, he actually was Lord Fairfax. And he claimed the title, and that gives some credibility to some of these Southern Democrats calling themselves the chivalry. In that case, I guess Mark Twain was right when he said the South had read too many novels by Sir Walter Scott. It started with a vote on a resolution as to whether California would stay in the Union. It won overwhelmingly in the state assembly and the state senate, but there were a few state senators and 12 assembly members who voted no. Assemblyman Showalter was one of the people who voted no, and he requested some time so that he could make a speech on the floor and explain his vote. Assemblyman Piercy said, no, we don't have time for that. Making speeches is not on the agenda. It's a yes or a no vote, and then we do the resolution. Well, they started insulting each other, and they're trading personal insults over the last days of the 1861 session of the California State Assembly. And finally, on the last day, Showalter challenged Piercy to a duel. They went to Lord Fairfax's house, and then once again, the pro-Southerner walked away from the duel, whereas the pro-Northern politician died. So on the East Coast, people were mourning Elmer Ellsworth, who was one of the first casualties of the war on the East Coast. He was the Union martyr over there, but over here, Charles Piercy was the pro-Union martyr. So what else was going on in California in May and April of 1861? This scene from the movie Gettysburg may be very familiar to some of y'all. This is a scene where Richard Jordan, playing General Louis Armistead, is talking with Longstreet, who is played by Tom Berenger, and he's asking him, have you heard any news of old Winnie Boy? And he's talking about Winfield Scott Hancock, his old Army buddy. And then Longstreet says, Hancock, oh yeah, you guys are going to be fighting them tomorrow, something along those lines. And then Armistead starts waxing emotionally about how he really misses his old friend. It's a darn shame that they have to be on opposite sides of the war. And he's making allusions to a party that a bunch of regular Army guys had in California, which was their last night before everybody went off to the war to go kill each other. Well, that party that he's talking about happened in Los Angeles, actually, on the ranch owned by the brother of Albert Sidney Johnston, and it was very much the way it was described in the movie. You know, they had a bonfire, and you know, they had some drinks and cigars, and everybody embraced and said, all right, well, good luck, see you guys later. So that happened in Los Angeles in April of 1861, and some very interesting things happened in this county and in some of the adjoining counties at that time. What else did we find in Los Angeles other than a ranch that was owned by Albert Sidney Johnston's brother? The Quartermaster Corps for the Pacific Department of Southern California was located in present-day downtown Los Angeles, and Winfield Scott Hancock was staying in a barracks that was a little farmhouse with a corral about 2 blocks away. So on the left is an old photo from the 1880s of the Hancock House. This is where Major Hancock at the time was staying in Los Angeles by himself for a couple of weeks. That must have been really nerve-wracking. There were all these pro-secession parties planning to rip California out of the Union, and how many Union soldiers were in Los Angeles. For a period of about 4 or 5 weeks, it was just Hancock, and he was guarding, some tents full of random supplies, horse saddles, boots, maybe a few uniforms, a few weapons and carbines, some food supplies. It was just him. And then on the right is the intersection of Spring Street and 2nd Street in downtown LA, where you see the brown marble stripe in the building. There's a little historical plaque, and then that'll tell you something about that was the site of the first built schoolhouse in Los Angeles, which I don't care about, but it was also the site of the U.S. Army Quartermaster Corps, which I absolutely do care about. And very briefly, the Camel Corps was keeping the Union Army camels there. The Camel Corps experiment was cool stuff. It was Jeff Davis's idea when he was the U.S. Secretary of War. It was a partial success. It did prove what he was suspecting, that camels are way better at crossing the desert than horses. They will lose less camels. The problem was, though, camels are jerks. They bite, they spit, they operate when they want to operate. The only people that they would listen to was Haji Ali, the Syrian camel herder, and a couple of his apprentices. But they were notorious for kicking and biting and spitting at the Union soldiers. And they also scared the crap out of all the Union Army horses. The horses would not be near the camels. So that's why by 1861 there were only a few camels left. But California had some Union Army camels. And about 2 blocks away from these locations is the site of Fletcher Bower Square, which was the original site of the Bella Union Hotel. The Bella Union Hotel was important for a couple of reasons. It housed other businesses and other venues inside of the building, not just the hotel and the bar itself. It also housed the courthouse. Like the Los Angeles courthouse was inside of this hotel, so if somebody had to get a trial, they had to go get taken inside the courthouse. And I hope that it was a jury of their peers, because you just know after the guy was either pronounced guilty or not guilty, and then taken away in handcuffs, the sheriff's deputies were walking like 2 doors down to go have a drink at the bar, because why not? I mean, I would if I was a deputy and it was 2 doors down. And also it was the center where the Los Angeles Star newspaper was headquartered. The Los Angeles Star was as pro-secession of a newspaper as anybody can possibly get. It was all the time calling Abraham Lincoln a tyrant and a petty despot who likes to burn down the Constitution. And the editor of the Los Angeles Star had so much vitriol for the Union cause, for the Union Army, for the President of the United States, that he actually got arrested by the Union Army in 1862. He was held for a couple of months in one of the military prisons that was around California. These were not really big, sophisticated buildings like Libby Prison. Usually they would appropriate an old hotel or an adobe house or a horse corral or a stockade or something like that and just block the people in there. Could not have been a pleasant experience. So they eventually paroled him. He took the oath that he was going to stay loyal to the Union. But of course, he took that as encouragement, the fact that he was being released, to immediately continue calling Abraham Lincoln a tyrant and Abraham Africanus and all kinds of very, very colorful things that I can't even talk about without cracking up. Well, people are getting arrested over this stuff. It was absolutely insane. But he redoubled his passion and his efforts after his arrest to the point where he campaigned for state senate in 1863, and he was elected. He was the state senator for California, so there was another secessionist that was in the state legislature and gave the Union Army plenty of cause to be stressed out because they thought that this guy was going to rile people up and try to get revenge. We don't know if he was plotting revenge, but other people would have been happy to join him in that plot. What else is happening around Southern California? In March of 1861, because of the war that was starting on the East Coast, the Pony Express and the Butterfield stagecoach lines both lost their federal contracts, so those mail and freight services were absolutely suspended. So with the exception of getting on a steamboat, which would either take you around South America or it would take you down to Panama, where you had to take a train or a stagecoach for 45 miles, and then take another boat that would take you up to the east coast of the United States. If you weren't doing that, you were basically stuck in Southern California, and it was quite a few weeks until they were able to get news from the outside world. So people losing their mail service was deeply concerning, and it affected quality of life. You had Western senators and congressmen were openly discussing forming a Pacific Republic. One of the chief ironies of the Civil War in California is governor turned senator Milton Latham got a Union Army camp named after him, as other pro-Union politicians were proud to do. The Union Army would name camps after somebody who was known to be pro-Union. Well, this guy with the Union Army camp named after him was having secret meetings in the halls of the U.S. Capitol in Washington, D.C. with the senators and congressmen from Oregon and from the Utah Territory and New Mexico. And they were talking about the western states and territories seceding and forming a Republic of the Pacific. And then the U.S. Army, which was performing garrison duty, frontier duty really, in California, they got called back to the East Coast. So Fort Tejon, north of Los Angeles, was abandoned, and then Fort Mojave on the border of California and the New Mexico Territory, which is today California and Arizona's border, that fort was abandoned. So now the Mojave warriors and other tribes with some kind of a grievance against the United States or against Anglo-American settlers were free to raid in those areas. So safety went down the drain. And after the Battle of Fort Sumter on the East Coast, Abraham Lincoln called for 75,000 volunteers, and that call was not only heard on the East Coast, California answered that call. Over 17,000 soldiers through California joined the Union Army. Most of them served in the California Volunteers, but because there were more people in California than there were in the other states and territories in the West Coast and Southwest combined, California troops were also serving in the Oregon Volunteers, the Washington Territory Volunteers, the New York Volunteers, the Pennsylvania Volunteers, and the Massachusetts Volunteers. And eventually, once Arizona and Nevada became a thing, California soldiers would enlist to serve on paper as Nevada and Arizona soldiers. So California answered the call, and in addition to those 17,000 soldiers, there were also 8,000 soldiers that joined the California State Militia. And they were absolutely instrumental in holding down infrastructure for whichever cause they supported. Most of them were pro-Union, but not all of them. And let me tell you about one particular California militia unit that was pro-Confederate. The Los Angeles Mounted Rifles. This militia company was formed in the city of Los Angeles in April of 1861. And the state government was really counting on this militia company to be of great service to the Union, because more than 50% of the men who enlisted in the Los Angeles Mounted Rifles were LA Sheriff's deputies. Unfortunately for the Adjutant General and the state government, these particular militia volunteers were not pro-Union, they were absolutely pro-secession. And their plan was to swear themselves in, start drilling, and then get outfitted with weapons by the state government, which did happen. And then after they got their rifles, they were going to ski-daddle across the great American desert and get their butts over to Texas so they could join the Confederate Army. The commander of the Los Angeles Mounted Rifles was Captain Alonzo Ridley, who was one of the undersheriffs of Los Angeles. The deputy commander of this unit was Tomas Sanchez, who was the sheriff of Los Angeles. Tomas Sanchez did not go on the eastbound trek with this militia company, but Captain Ridley did. A lot of the guys in the company got cold feet at the last second, so of 82 men who joined the militia company, about 32 of them actually went on the trek, which is still quite a few guys. I mean, there were more than 30 soldiers. They were not regular civilians anymore. They were California state militia soldiers sworn in and outfitted. They went across the desert with their guns. But this contribution to the Confederate war effort is important because they had two very important VIPs with them. One of them was Captain Louis Armistead, and his son. Armistead was traveling from Los Angeles to Texas because he was getting ready to receive a commission in the Confederate Army. He would eventually become a general in the Army of Northern Virginia. And the other very important person was General Albert Sidney Johnston, who was the commander of the Pacific Department. That was another, a Virginian turned Texan, a Tennessean turned Texan, serving as the commander of the Pacific Department. And he was named in that position last minute by President James Buchanan, who was a pro-Southerner, and he allowed a lot of the chaos to happen. That made a lot of the Union Army guys in the Department of the Pacific very nervous, made guys in the War Department very nervous. Ironically, as Pacific Department commander, General Johnston did not do anything to further the Confederate war efforts, but he certainly did as a civilian and eventually as a general in the Confederate Army. So, by the way, just for the sake of mentioning, Johnston was also accompanied on this trip by his slave, Randolph Hughes. So there is a quote-unquote black Confederate for any of you guys who are interested in that kind of thing. But I promise you, Mr. Hughes did not have a choice in the matter. So they made it to Texas. And this inspired other guys in Los Angeles and in El Monte to form another militia company called the Monte Mounted Rifles. And they were hoping that they would also be accepted into state service and get outfitted with guns so that they could skedaddle across the desert and help out the Confederacy. By this time, the War Department and the California Mill Department were totally on to these guys in Los Angeles. So the Monte Mounted Rifles were not mustered into the state militia. The California state government wanted absolutely nothing to do with them, and they definitely were not going to give these guys guns. Now, this is a colorized version of an illustration that originally appeared in Harper's Weekly. You can tell it's a very dramatized representation of the Los Angeles Mounted Rifles crossing the desert, because number one, you've got Albert Sidney Johnston dressed in buckskin clothing, which was not a thing. He was wearing a civilian suit in California. I don't know where he would have had time to get this buckskin clothing while he was serving as commander of the Pacific Department in downtown San Francisco. And also they've got a Native American guide whose hairstyle and threads do not match the styles of any of the known tribes residing in California at the time. And to our knowledge, there were no Native Americans that were on this expedition. This is just the imagination of an artist somewhere in the Washington, D.C. area. But this was something that happened. Part of the California National Guard effectively defected to the Confederacy, and they took their weapons with them. And Under Sheriff Ridley eventually became an officer in the 3rd Texas Regiment of the Arizona Brigade, the Confederate Army's Arizona Brigade. The shorthand for that is the 3rd Texas Arizona. So if you ever want to study the Arizona Brigade like I have, the 1st Texas Cavalry Regiment of Arizona and the 1st Texas Cavalry Regiment of Texas are not the same unit, though they would later work together very often in the Red River Campaign. I'm not going to go through all these names, but this is just an abbreviation, a summary of some of the guys who had a government post somewhere in California who defected to the Confederacy. So you see at the very top is Senator William Gwin. He went back to his plantation. He didn't take a post in the Army or in the government or anything, but from his plantation he gave money and material support to the Confederate Army. Representative Charles Scott was a California congressman, ended up in the Alabama Infantry. If I'm not mistaken, he had an arrest warrant put out for him here in California because he published a 16-page pamphlet about why California should secede from the Union, and he started distributing it while he was still serving as a United States congressman. So he ended up in the 4th Alabama Infantry. Retired Congressman Philemon Herbert, he stopped being congressman sometime in 1857, but after this he was the commander of the Arizona Cavalry Battalion. We've already said David Terry was the Chief Justice. The Major General of the California State Militia went back home to the South, and from his home he provided the Confederate Army with money and material support. Dan Showalter, the Assemblyman from Mariposa County, who I've already mentioned, became an officer in the 4th Texas Arizona Cavalry. And then on the second column, the second bullet point, Cameron Tom, former District Attorney of Los Angeles. He vacated that office in 1857, so he was free. You know, he didn't have any other pressing commitments in 1861. But he went back home to Virginia, and he was an officer, I believe, in the Army of Northern Virginia. and ex-DA Tom was wounded at the Battle of Gettysburg, fighting for the Confederacy. We've already mentioned Alonzo Ridley, 3rd Texas, Arizona, and then a former undersheriff of Monterey County, Tom Poole, joined the Bushwhacker band that was wreaking havoc in Northern California in 1864, that being Captain Ingram's Partisan Rangers. During that time that Winfield Scott Hancock was by himself holding down the fort in downtown LA, the Union Army briefly established a camp at the Quartermaster Corps headquarters while they were building this brand new facility, which would be named Camp Drum. Camp Drum was named after Captain Richard Drum. He was a cavalry officer, one of the few regulars, Army regulars, who was in California at the beginning of the war. They named the post in his honor, and this base was the Pacific Department's Department of Southern California headquarters for the Union Army, and then after the Arizona campaign, where the Union Army, the California soldiers in the Union Army kicked the Confederates out of Arizona, then Camp Drum also became the headquarters for Arizona because it was effectively an island. There was a big wilderness of angry Apaches and Navajos and Comanches in between Confederate Arizona, soon to be Union Arizona, and Texas. So this made sense to be the administrative center. The black and white photo is an original photo. You can see in the middle is one of those Union camels. And then the big photo is one that I took at the Christmas shindig that was happening at the Drum Barracks Museum back in October. And the gentleman in the Union Army uniform is my good friend Fernando, who is one of the docents at this museum. And if you've never been to one of their official events, I highly recommend you go. It was a ball. When I went to the Christmas event, I was only planning to be there for maybe an hour, take some photos, take a little video for my YouTube channel, and then bounce out of there. But I just started talking to people and talking to people and talking to people who knew things that I didn't know. And next thing you know, I was like a kid in a candy store. And 6 hours later, I was limping away from the drum barracks. So in that letter that I read to you at the beginning, the author makes a mention of the Monte, which is kind of a Spanglish term. He's talking about the city of El Monte, which means the Mount, and the Monte is Spanglish. If there was any center in Southern California that was the absolute focal point of pro-secession activity, it was El Monte. Yes, there was pro-secession activity in San Diego, in San Bernardino, in the city of Los Angeles, in the areas between present-day Bakersfield and Visalia, but El Monte was the absolute capital. That was the place where the secessionists who did not go east with Albert Sidney Johnston and Armistead and Captain Ridley, this is the place where they decided to make that militia company, where the California state government said, hell no. They still continued meeting and drilling, even though they weren't organized, so that was a place. And the El Monte Hotel was the social center of El Monte. So the Knights of the Golden Circle, which was a pro-secession, it was a politicized fraternity, but it was a pro-secession fraternity. And if you've never studied the Knights of the Golden Circle very much, they basically copied all of the Masonic rituals, except it was all for secession and slavery. The reason they were called the Knights of the Golden Circle is because the southern states around the Gulf of Mexico, including Texas, and in their mind, Southern California and the New Mexico Territory as well, and then Central America, and then the top part of South America and the Caribbean islands. In their mind, that was the Golden Circle. And the future, the bright future to them, that they envisioned was a golden circle of plantation-based slaveholding republics with plantation-based economies. They saw that that was going to be the natural, logical conclusion of the American dream. Thomas Jefferson's Empire of Liberty, they thought that that applied to them specifically. So when they're thinking of an Empire of Liberty or a golden circle, they're talking about an Empire of Liberty for Anglo-American or European-American white men who take their quote-unquote rightful position of domination over the African whose natural condition is to work. And that's just the way that things are supposed to be. And they had all kinds of passcripts and passwords and secret little rituals, secret passwords that they would exchange just to make sure that they weren't, giving information away to a stranger. So even though it was a paramilitary organization, it was very much their secret club, and it was really elaborate. And El Monte was the capital in Southern California of pro-secession activity. And there was a lot of shenanigans happening in the triangle between El Monte, Los Angeles, and the city and mountains of San Bernardino. The next interesting place where shenanigans were happening was Holcomb Valley. If you've never heard of Holcomb Valley, it is right next to Bear Valley. Bear Valley is where Big Bear Lake is at. Holcomb Valley is the very next one, and if you're familiar with the Boy Scouts of America, there was a Boy Scout camp operating up there for many, many decades. I camped there for the first time as a weebelo and froze my butt off, and I didn't start having a good time there until I was a grown man, and I didn't have to be there. But Holcomb Valley is a beautiful place. It was the site of the Belleville boomtown. It was on the claim that was staked out by a pioneer by the name of Grizzly Bill Holcomb. He found some gold on his claim, and the way boomtowns worked in the Wild West, somebody strikes gold or silver or another mineral one day, and literally within a few days there will be 500 people there setting up their tents. And if the gold, if there's enough, for everybody, 3 months will pass by, and now there's a saloon and stables and hotels and whatnot. So there's about 1,500 people in this boomtown of Belleville, and that was almost the population of the city of San Bernardino. So during the 1861 election, Belleville almost beat San Bernardino to become the San Bernardino County seat, which would have been a little awkward for the San Bernardino residents, where we can call this the County of Belleville. It didn't happen that way, but they came close. And I have not found any evidence directly linking Grizzly Bill to the activities of the Knights of the Golden Circle, but he did know what was happening on his land, and he turned a blind eye. There is absolutely no way that he didn't know what was going on, because there are photographs of Grizzly Bill after the war, together with some of the people from California who actually left to go fight for the Confederacy. So there's no way that he didn't know what was going on. The Knights of the Golden Circle was having their political meetings to recruit people in San Bernardino City and other cities, whereas up in Holcomb Valley is where they were making camp. And there were a couple of things that they were trying to do there. Number one, there was a reverse underground railroad of Southern sympathizers from Northern California who were making their way down the Sierra Nevadas, and then they would stay for a time in Holcomb Valley until they went to some other places. And they were going to either take their chance hightailing it across the desert, or they were going to take the Colorado River, or some other means of transportation south to Mexico, and then from the safety of Mexico, where they can't get arrested by the Union, they were going to go to Texas. So Ben Harris and Dan Showalter were some of the people who came down from Northern California and hid out in Holcomb Valley. You already know Dan Showalter was the northern-born Southern Democrat who killed the state assemblyman from San Bernardino in that duel, and who eventually became an officer in the Arizona Brigade. Ben Harris was the commander of the Mariposa Mounted Riflemen, which was a militia company up in Mariposa County. That's the gateway to Yosemite. And he resigned his commission in April of 1861. And then 5 months later, Mr. Harris's law firm advertisements stopped appearing in the Mariposa Free Press. And he pretty much disappeared from all trace of human existence until 1863, when he shows up in the Texas troops of the Confederate Army. Ben Harris made it successfully to Confederate territory the first time. Dan Showalter was not successful. He was traveling separately from Ben Harris with a party of 17 or 18 other people. Some of them were people that he recruited in Visalia, but most of them were guys from the Mariposa and Modesto area. A number of them had been founding members of the Mariposa militia. Well, they were his constituents, so he was traveling down with them, and this party got overtaken by a patrol, a cavalry patrol that was attached to the 1st California Infantry Regiment, and they caught them near Oak Grove Station in modern-day San Diego County. So this is in eastern San Diego County, and it's somewhere in that stretch of land between Temecula and the tiny village of Julian. If you have not been to Julian to hike on one of the trails and have some apple pie, I promise you, you are missing out. So I don't think Mr. Showalter was having a whole lot of apple pie, because he was busy getting arrested. And they made an excuse that they're just minors, they were going to go stake a claim somewhere on the Colorado River. But they already knew who Showalter was, because people from San Bernardino had been tipping off the Union Army that the Showalter gang, that's what they were calling them, the Showalter gang is traveling this way, they're heavily armed. And then when the California Union soldiers found these guys, they had months worth of provisions, and then they were armed to the teeth. Now, it was common for miners to have a personal weapon, like a pistol, a shotgun, or a rifle, and maybe a couple dozen rounds, but these guys had hundreds of rounds. They were armed to the teeth. There was no question about what they were going to do. And then the other telltale part was most people, unless they're psychopaths, unless they're clinical psychopaths, have a really difficult time of lying. So most of the guys told the white lie that, well, yeah, I'm definitely not going to go fight for the Confederacy. I believe in states' rights, but I'm a loyal American patriot, and yes, I would take the Union loyalty oath. Well, a couple of these guys, though, they could not bring themselves to say, yes, I will take the Union Army's loyalty oath. So that was another telltale sign that gave him away as secessionists. So they got arrested. And originally they were holding him at Camp Wright, which is the Army camp that's by Oak Grove Station. It's today off of Highway 79. The camp is not there, but the old stagecoach station is there. And when I was doing research on location there a couple months ago, I wanted to take a photo of the old stagecoach station, but I felt really awkward doing it because it's still a private residence and somebody actually lives there still today. And they were home while I was creeping around their house. So I decided to not be that creepy guy, but God is my witness. The stagecoach station is still there on Highway 79. The camp is not, but there is a really pretty marker. They originally held him as prisoner in Camp Wright off of modern-day Highway 79, but because of intelligence reports that the Knights of the Golden Circle was planning a group of about 50 guys to go and liberate the Showalter party and shoot it out with the Union soldiers, they moved Mr. Showalter and the other prisoners to the more secure location of Fort Yuma, which is on the Arizona side of the Colorado River. Well, it's in Arizona. Do I need to say anything else? How would you feel if you were in prison in Arizona back in the 1860s, no air conditioning, it's hotter than Satan's behind. Absolutely not a good time for Showalter. So after a few months, they let him out, but that radicalized him. That experience made him hate the Union even more. So he swallowed his pride and he took the Union loyalty oath, and Showalter disappeared again. This time he played it safe. Instead of trying to cut across San Diego County to the Arizona Territory, he took a steamship down to Mexico and then slowly made his way to Texas. But there was a lot that was going on, so let me read you another letter that was written from a camp near San Bernardino. This is from Major Scott Ketchum of the 4th California Infantry Regiment, and this is addressed to the Assistant Adjutant General of the Department of the Pacific up in San Francisco. Sir, on the 8th of this month, I informed you what reports had been made to me respecting a party which was attacked en route to the mines in Holcomb Valley. Mr. Stemper, who was originally reported killed, was actually wounded. Luckily, he jumped off his horse and fired 4 times at his assailants, 2 in number who ran off and left him. Mr. Stemper was shot in the thigh through the flesh, and the ball lodged in his wallet in his trousers pocket, which undoubtedly saved his life. Mr. Bogon, traveling with him, was shot in the shoulder. He is now in San Bernardino and will no doubt recover, as his is a flesh wound only. Mr. Fuller, the expressman, is safe. He jumped off his horse and ran. He thinks those who attacked him secured his horse. Of this, however, he has no knowledge. Fuller, who returned to San Bernardino, says he saw 9 persons in the attacking party, and he thinks there were more from the noises heard by him. Mr. Green, the clerk, is also safe and is now in Holcomb Valley. He reports that he fought his way through to Deer Creek Station, hence nobody was killed and only 2 wounded. Constable St. John took a posse and went in search of the depredators, so I have been informed, but he has not made any arrests yet, although he suspects those who are concerned. Respectfully, your obedient servant, W. Scott Ketchum, Major, 4th Infantry Commanding. So this is in September of 1861. So this is the second story you have heard of people in the vicinity of San Bernardino getting shot in paramilitary violence. So it may have taken a while for Bleeding Kansas to fully make it to California, but in 1861, as people read news of 2 armies going at it back on the East Coast, these different paramilitary groups were going at it right here in Southern California, in the mountains and in the towns. 1 month after this letter was written by Major Ketchum, this gentleman on the screen, Clarence Edmund Bennett, was elected the commander of a reformed militia company called the San Bernardino Rangers. They were reformed in October of 1861, specifically as a response to what was happening in their city. It had been originally formed in the 1850s to fight against outlaws, but the militia went defunct, and like a lot of militia companies in California, they were never formally mustered out. People kind of just stopped showing up, and then eventually some clerk in Sacramento would declare them defunct. But in October of 1861, they were back in action, and they elected Clarence as their commanding officer, partly because he was a retired career soldier. At that time, he was still in his 30s, but he had spent more than a decade of his life in the United States Army, and he was originally deployed to the California area in response to what's called the Utah Mormon War. Not a whole lot of people fell in that conflict, but people did die, and different militia companies around the New Mexico and Territory and California were formed because folks back then fully believed that there was going to be a war between the United States and the Latter-day Saints Church. And it never ended up fully happening that way, but different units were formed. So this former regular Army officer ended up moving to San Bernardino after he mustered out of the Army, and he married the daughter of a local LDS bishop. So, on one hand, you've got Clarence Bennett, who was avowedly a Union man, was constantly writing intelligence reports to different members of the Army. Even before he was elected into the militia company, he wrote to the Secretary of War back in Washington, D.C., he wrote to the commander of the Pacific Department up in San Francisco. He wrote to Captain Richard Drum, who was the regular who was stationed down here. He wrote to Major James Carleton down at the new Camp Drum. He was writing letters to everybody, letting them know the secessionists are active in this city. They've got paramilitary training camps up in the Holcomb Valley Mountains where they're helping people escape to go fight for the Confederacy, and they're also giving militia training to people who don't already have military training up there. We need troops here. It's happening here. The war has come to San Bernardino. Help. So because of the letters that he and other pro-Union citizens are writing, the Union Army did establish a camp right outside of San Bernardino. I think it was Camp Fitzgerald. I could be mistaken about the name. But from that point on, soldiers from Camp Drum were regularly patrolling places like El Monte and San Bernardino City, specifically to make it really difficult for the pro-Confederate paramilitary groups out there to actually do their shenanigans. And because of what he was doing, and because everybody knew who he was, what he was doing, and where he lived, eventually, after 6 months, Captain Bennett had to resign his position in the militia company because he feared for his life. And all he said was, "I desire to be outside of San Bernardino for a short while." And with his leadership gone, the militia company went defunct once again, and it was disbanded. So for a little while, the secessionists almost ran wild in San Bernardino, except for when the Union Army would come patrol. However, he gets a little bit of a redemption arc. The following year, Clarence Bennett returned to his newly adopted home city of San Bernardino as an officer in the 1st California Cavalry Regiment, and he absolutely knew who to arrest. He stayed 3 months in San Bernardino as a Union cavalry officer. I don't doubt that he asked to continue being posted in San Bernardino, but by 1863, the Union Army had already kicked the Confederate Army out of Arizona. They launched that military operation originally from Camp Drum in the LA Harbor, and then they slowly made their way across North America, and they had to only send about 25 guys across the desert at a time. Otherwise, the wells would go dry, and then they would die of thirst. And the other thing that happened, which was a little bit complicated, was this minor detail called the Great Flood of 1862, in which basically it started raining a lot in October of 1861, and it did not stop raining until February of 1861. So from the Washington Territory to San Diego, all the way inland to the Utah Territory, everything flooded, and much of the infrastructure in Southern California was washed away. The Los Angeles River, the San Gabriel River, and the Santa Ana River all flooded, and closer to the coast, they overlapped. So there was a new inland sea 18 miles wide, flooding out different infrastructure in Southern California where these 3 rivers met and then rejoined the ocean. The Colorado River was flooded, so small towns across San Bernardino County were just washed away as if they had never existed. And that's one reason why it took so long for the Union Army to actually get into this new territory called Arizona and kick the Confederate Army out. By 1863, the Army was still in occupation duty in Arizona, but the Confederacy was not the only threat to United States authority in the territory. You might have heard of this group called the Apache Nation. They took exception to Arizona being United States territory. So the Apaches, one of the things that's absolutely phenomenal about the Apache Nation and some of its leaders, different band leaders, you've got band leaders like Cochise and Mangas Coloradas, and then you had war leaders like Geronimo. These Apache leaders and the warriors that they commanded fought against the Confederate Army, and they fought against the Union Army. So Captain Bennett would have liked to have stayed in San Bernardino, but they sent his behind over to Arizona on occupation duty. And then the Knights of the Golden Circle continued to be active around San Bernardino and also Los Angeles counties until 1865. So let me give you a little example here. This is a letter from Gustav Brown, who was a detective working for the Union Army. That does not mean that he was actually a sworn federal law enforcement peace officer. There were a lot of private detectives back then, like the Pinkerton Agency. They were contractors, they were given respect and authority, and they were given a lot of liberty, but they were private companies. So Gustav Brown was another one of these private detectives who was working for the Union Army here in California. And he writes to Captain A. Jones Jackson, Provost Marshal, Southern District of California, "Sir, I have the honor to lay before you the following report as to the intentions of the Knights of the Golden Circle and the counties of San Luis Obispo and Los Angeles. San Luis has 242 members, all armed with revolvers, rifles, or shotguns. Their governor is Parker. Lieutenant governor is D. Blackburn. They have a member of their order who belongs to the Union League in every league of the states, who reports to them all that is done and said at the meeting of the leagues. There are also 3 men who belong to the company of soldiers that is stationed in the town of San Luis Obispo, members of 33 of the Knights of the Golden Circle. Los Angeles County has 253, of which the town of Los Angeles has 54 men, El Monte, 92, the San Gabriel Mines, 27, and the remainder are scattered around in different places throughout the county. Their governor is Charles Howard, Lieutenant Governor James Callan, all armed with different weapons. They have picked out a place about 120 miles from Los Angeles called Rock Creek for a rendezvous. It is in the mountains and has plenty of wood, water, and grass. There are but 4 or 5 there now being ordered, and they will commence guerrilla warfare. They say there are men organized in Nevada for the purpose of coming into California in case of an outbreak for the purpose of assisting the Knights. They consist mainly of the sporting class. I have tried a good many of the upper class, and but very few of them know anything about the order, that is, about Los Angeles. The most of the people in and around this place are in favor of the South. They would not like to take an active part in anything that would tend to bring about a quarrel with the federal government, but they are all willing to furnish the means to do so." And then he goes on to describe 3 different degrees in the organization of the Knights. Remember, I said they ripped off as much as they possibly could from the Freemasons. So there are 3 different degrees, and based on what degree you are in the Knights of the Golden Circle, the more information, military intelligence that you commanded. And he goes on to complain that he almost got found out by one of these guys when he got one of the passwords wrong, and that he's clarifying, this is the correct passcrypt, so make sure that you say and do this and not this other thing. And there are other intelligence reports about Judge Terry, who was organizing men in El Monte to do guerrilla warfare to help the South and damage the Union war effort. If you'll remember, Judge Terry was the Chief Justice of the Supreme Court. He killed Senator Broderick, and now in 1861, all the way until the end of 1862 and 1863, he was active in Southern California trying to help the Confederate war effort. Well, eventually Judge Terry did make it to Texas, where briefly he served in the 8th Texas Cavalry Regiment, Terry's Texas Rangers. It was actually his brother's regiment, so David Terry was not the Terry of the Texas Rangers. The Texas Rangers belonged to his brother, and after a few months he was given his own commission in the 37th Texas Cavalry, And one of the reasons why that's important, other than the fact that here is yet another senior-ranking politician from California who was in the Confederate Army, but he was given command of the 4th Texas Arizona Cavalry Regiment. So most of them were enlisted in Texas, but that unit was actually raised under the Arizona Territory's banner. So even though Arizona Confederate Territory didn't exist physically, it still existed on paper. They still had a congressional delegate in Richmond who was drawing a paycheck until 1865. They still had soldiers serving in the Confederate Army as Arizona soldiers, and this guy was in command of the 4th Texas Arizona, which was the group that was the furthest west. Everybody else was in Arkansas and northern Louisiana, fighting against the Union Army over there. Alonzo Ridley, former undersheriff of Los Angeles, was captured in the Battle of Manfield, and he spent the next 2 years of the war in a POW camp. But former Chief Justice Terry was organizing some of the Arizona soldiers to recruit from Arizona Territory, West Texas, and from Southern California and Nevada to build an expedition to go reconquer Arizona from the Union Army, and then move into Southern California and conquer Southern California for the Confederacy. So even though the Confederacy was on its last legs in late 1864 and was totally almost annihilated in 1865, the Confederate Army was actually kicking a lot of butt west of the Mississippi River, so places like Texas, Arkansas, and then in Judge Terry's mind, he really believed that for at least a couple of years, the Confederate States of America is going to be West Texas, Confederate Arizona, and Southern California. It never happened that way, but he did send commissioned officers in the Confederate Army into California who went on recruiting missions. So Captain Henry Kennedy, he actually arrived in San Francisco in 1864, and he was constantly on the run because people he thought were his friends were not really his friends, and he was having to escape capture by the Union Army. So he narrowly escaped capture in San Francisco, and then he narrowly escaped capture again in Virginia City, Nevada. Nevada was a new territory. They called it the battle-worn state, even though really West Virginia is the battle-worn state. But technically Nevada was also born during some kind of a battle, so it was a battle-worn state, and Captain Kennedy had to run away. I hope that makes sense to everybody, okay? And Justice Terry's dream did not come to pass, but that did not mean that peace would come to Southern California, even when Lee's army started to surrender in April of 1865, which kicked off a chain reaction of other Confederate armies either surrendering or deciding to continue to fight during April, May, and June of 1865. There were still men in California who fancied themselves bushwhackers. Now, I wish I had time to tell you guys about Captain Ingram's Partisan Rangers, but they were wreaking havoc up in Northern California. The bushwhackers who made it to Southern California, other than the bushwhackers who were shooting people around Holcomb Valley and the San Bernardino Mountains, there was another group called the Mason-Henry Gang, named after John Henry and James Mason. Those were pseudonyms of a couple of career outlaws who happened to be in California in 1861, and they thought that they were going to start a unit of partisan rangers and fight for the Confederate Army. We don't know if they were serious about that. I think they probably were serious in the beginning, but the thing about organizing a military unit and then maintaining military operations, especially when you're a guerrilla and you don't have a logistical supply line where Richmond is paying for all your bills and supplies, you know, it's work. And career outlaws have never particularly been apt to do real work. So really fast, the Mason-Henry Gang's bushwhacker campaign turned into just a regular violent crime spree, and they did what they'd done before the war, which was rob and murder people. However, one thing that we often see in other civil wars in other parts of the world is there is military violence on one hand between armies, but then there is political violence with criminal overtones, and then criminal violence with some political overtones. And the Mason-Henry Gang was absolutely about criminal violence with political overtones, because most of their known murder victims were known to be Republicans. So were they helping the Confederacy? Not really, but were they hurting the Union? Yeah, they were, because they were robbing stagecoaches, and that was bullion that was going to pay for the Union Army's operations here on the western half of the continent, so they did do some damage. Well, there is a very special unit, the 1st California Native Cavalry Battalion. This is one of the few ethnically designated units in American military history with either an ethnic or a religious designation. A lot of folks have heard of the Mormon Battalion during the Mexican War. That was the only unit with a specific religious designation. And you've heard of the United States Colored Troops, which was federal soldiers, that was all African Americans. But here in California, there was a Hispanic military unit, and that was the 1st California Native Cavalry Battalion. So Native did not mean that they were Native American as in Chumash and Tongva. You might know the Tongva as Gabrielino, but their real name is Tongva. By Native, that means they were the people living here when California was lost by a different political entity and became part of the United States. These were the Mexican-American soldiers. Although there were South American immigrants, mostly Chileans and Peruvians, because they were here because of the gold rush, they were here for the mining, and there were a few European immigrants that were in the unit, but it was mostly ethnically Mexican Californians. And they fought in 4 different conflicts, organized in 1863, and it took about a year to train and outfit all of them, so they didn't really get going until 1864. But they fought in the Bald Hills Indian War in 1864, and then in January of 1865, they were chasing the Mason-Henry gang after the Mason-Henry gang killed another Republican. So this unit chased them all the way from Monterey County to present-day Kern County, and then these guys escaped the cavalry soldiers. That's when the Mason-Henry gang split up. So one part of the group went with James Mason, the other part of the group went with John Henry, and John Henry hid out in San Jacinto Canyon in San Bernardino County, where the San Bernardino Sheriff's Posse got him. So that guy was annihilated by 57 gunshots and a hail of lead. Whereas the last guy kept wreaking havoc until 1866, but eventually he was arrested by a different sheriff's posse and he was hung. But after they were chasing the Mason-Henry gang, the California Lancers was deployed to Arizona Territory. From Arizona, they chased Mexican soldiers who had done a raid into Arizona. They chased them back into Mexico. They did not find them, but they were very proud that they got to fight against some French soldiers. Now, asterisk, soldiers were not actually French soldiers. Ethnically, they were Mexican Indians, probably Yaqui, but they were definitely from the Mexican side of the line. But they had sworn loyalty to the French government under Maximilian, which was still in Mexico at that time. Now, for the Mexican Californians, that was very important to them because they generally supported Benito Juarez. They supported the Mexican Republic, not this French-installed Austrian emperor. So the California soldiers fought in the Bald Hill Indian War. They fought pro-rebel bushwhackers. They technically participated in the Mexican Civil War on the side of Benito Juarez, and all companies of the California Lancers fought against the Apaches during the Apache War. So that is one battalion of Hispanic soldiers who fought in 4 different conflicts in just a 2-year period. And that concludes this presentation on the Civil War in Southern California. If you would like to see a lot more awesome true stories about the war between the states and territories west of the Mississippi River, if you want more stories about what happened right here in Southern California and across the rest of the state, I welcome you to check out my YouTube channel, The Civil War Wild West Edition, so that you don't have to memorize the URL that's written on the screen. I left cards at the very front table over where Janet is fearlessly guarding them. If you would check out the channel, and if you are able to subscribe to channels on YouTube, please subscribe because it helps me out and it helps boost the channel's algorithms. And if you want some longer documentaries, we do have longer documentaries. My magnum opus up to right now is a 5-part YouTube documentary called The Confederate Territory of Arizona. It's about 2.5 hours total, and then I put a 6th part in addendum because it turns out when I started making this documentary in 2021, there was some information that I got wrong. So I did address that information because I don't want to just be that guy. I don't want to just leave a mess in the room, so I believe in owning up to my mistakes. And on March 15th is when we finally, after much delay, finally release my book, The Confederate Territory of Arizona, based on the same research that went into making the documentary. But in the book, I write about more battles and skirmishes and engagements with the Arizona troops that I did not have time to talk about in the documentary. Why March 15th? Number one, that gives me a little bit more time to do some of the logistical parts of it. We do have a book cover, it's very pretty, and I know exactly where I want to distribute it, but one of the reasons why I pulled it from its original release date is because if I'm going to ask people for money for this thing, especially for something that's self-published, I want it to be the best possible quality that it can be. So the original version was pretty short, it was about 75 pages, and then I expanded the narrative to be about 100 pages, and then I decided it would be really appropriate to include some documents, such as the original declaration where Arizona secedes from New Mexico in 1860, and then Arizona secedes from the United States in 1861, and then I included the Arizona Territorial Constitution of 1860. Then I included other documents like John Baylor's declaration where the Confederate Territory of Arizona exists, and I am the governor and commander-in-chief, and everybody's in martial law. And there's a number of other documents that are pertinent to that. But that concludes everything that I have to tell you tonight. I'm going to open it up for a few minutes of Q&A, and then whenever Nick or Janet wants to take the reins again, I am happy to give up the reins. But thank you for letting me come here.
Would it be a test?
You already passed the test. The test was enduring my voice.
Oh, I have one question. Why was California considered a free state versus?
Because officially slavery was not legal here, so you could not buy or purchase slaves in this territory.
As determined by legislature?
As determined by federal legislation, yeah.
Thank you very much. Great presentation. This is
Thank
something
you.
that I've been studying for years also. I'm very curious. You said that Albert Sidney Johnson had a brother. I know he had a brother-in-law, and that he was actually staying with the Griffins at some time around April '61. But did he have a brother, another family member?
It was probably his brother-in-law.
Okay. Okay, thank you.
In the back?
I'm glad you touched on foreign policy concerns with French Maximilian on the throne of Mexico and the like. I understand the feds were very worried about keeping California to the point, didn't they establish a base on Catalina Island in part to keep the Brits and the Russians and the French out of our gold mine and silver? And
Yes, they did establish a Union Army post on Catalina Island itself, as well as posts on the mainland up and down the San Diego coastline. And it's exactly for the reasons you said. They were worried about the British or the French or any other sea power being able to raid California, especially because it wasn't just the Army that got called back to the east. The Navy got called off of the California coast, and they were on their way to go engage in the Eastern Theater as well. Now, what they thought was that the raid was going to be somewhere between San Diego and Los Angeles, and it didn't actually turn out that way. The only hostile ship that approached California during that time was a Confederate privateer, which came steaming into San Francisco Bay before it was promptly apprehended by the Revenue Cutter Service, which is the precursor to the U.S. Coast Guard. And that must have been a what the hell moment for the American coastie, who was probably just smoking a cigarette and minding his own business when the ship came steaming in that night. Any other questions?
So there's a book on Confederate Territory of Arizona. When's the book on Confederacy and the Civil War in California going to be released?
Probably next year. I already have a title for it. It's called California's Confederate Insurgency. But before I go releasing that one, I want to be able to really promote the Confederate Territory of Arizona book on my channel and in some of my speaking engagements. Because that right there, we're talking about 3 years of research that went into that. And as a matter of fact, the research that led to that documentary is what gave birth to the channel in the first place. That started during the COVID pandemic, so while everybody else was locked inside, I was locked inside too, and I found a Wikipedia page about some interesting things happening here, and because I didn't have anywhere to go necessarily, I fell into a rabbit hole, and then I just kept reading and reading and reading, and I decided, Oh my gosh, I gotta write a book about this. Oh my gosh, I gotta make documentaries about this. Oh my gosh, I have to share these stories with the entire world. Let's go on YouTube right now. Yes, ma'am.
I wonder, you're probably familiar with the Kevin Waite's work, West of Slavery.
Yes, excellent work.
He combines a lot, this whole Western, the fact that he refers to California and Arizona as just client states of the Confederacy. That, and it was, maybe that's a bit of a stretch, but how very, he puts all the different parts together, and this reminds me of what you're doing. So.
Yeah, client states of the Confederacy is a little bit farther than I would go. The original government that organized Arizona, it was not Colonel Baylor. He proclaimed a new Arizona, but the original Arizona was started by pioneers, and they did eventually secede from the Union, and they had some pretty legitimate reasons for seceding, although in their secession declaration at the very end they threw in kind of a sucker punch insulting the black Republicans. Well, black folks were not voting, so they were talking about the Republican Party fighting for the rights of black Americans. They didn't like that either. But there was definitely a huge balance tilted towards Confederate sympathies. Now, Arizona was actually a Confederate territory. First they seceded and asked to join the CSA, and then they were formally incorporated into the CSA. While I wouldn't call California a client state, I did want to say at the beginning of the presentation that it was technically a free state, but most of its federal representatives were pro-slavery. So they kept slavery outside of California mostly, but they still voted in favor of slavery's interests in the Congress. So,
all the way through the 1850s, California voted in slave states.
Yeah. Any other questions, comments, concerns?
Where's the exact location of that El Monte Hotel?
I don't know the exact location. I think it is in present-day Rosemead, but I still have to cross-reference a couple more details, because after 1865, the hotel was purchased, and it was purchased by a Rebel Army veteran, but the name changed several times, and then there were other hotels in the future that had the name El Monte Hotel, and then other hotels in the future that had the same name of the very next name after it was the El Monte Hotel. So I still have to sift apart these different locations, because you have different physical locations claiming the same name, and it makes me kind of want to tear my hair out, but I'm going to do that for you guys because this is labor of love. All right, anybody else? Yes, sir.
So where are the Bennett archives, for example? You obviously done a lot of research, but how do you find the materials to further your research?
I don't know if any Bennett archives exist. Most of the information, yes, sir. Most of the letters and other information that we know about Captain Bennett came directly from the OR. So if you want the volume, it's serial number 151, and that's the one that deals with operations on the Pacific Coast. So yeah, these letters came directly from the OR, and the entire OR is available nowadays electronically, and not just a 9 gajillion gigabyte PDF file that's going to take an hour to download, but the actual text has been transcribed in electronic forms by Ohio State University. So you could read the whole thing online if you want, and that's how I found it. And by the way, I want to make one thing abundantly clear. I am standing on the shoulders of giants. A lot of my research is original. A lot of my research is me going out to physical locations and comparing the geography and the architecture of specific places with primary sources like the OR and other primary sources like letters and diaries. But my research would not be possible if it was not for technological advances, specifically of the last 10 years. Because so many documents that people would have had to check out at a library or go hunt down in some kind of an archives room or see if they can find it somewhere in the Indiana Jones boxes section of the Huntington Library. A lot of that stuff is online now. So if that was not online during the COVID pandemic and available for all of us, my research would not have been possible, and these books and documentaries on this YouTube channel would not exist. So yay, technology in the back.
So what is OR?
The official records of the War of the Rebellion. So the official records were compiled between the 1880s and the early 1900s, and that's where the Library of Congress and the National Archives and the War Department put their forces together to compile as many important documents about the war as they could. So you will find letters by Union Army generals and Confederate generals. You'll find letters and memos from the Union War Department in DC, the Confederate War Department, first in Montgomery and then in Richmond. You will find letters from cavalry officers out in the field and other kinds of memos and documents. They have letters from residents of Los Angeles and San Bernardino writing to the War Department saying, help us, please send soldiers. There are about 150 massive books that are between 1,000 and 1,500 pages each. The first wave was published in 1880, then 82, and then either 1900 or 1902. And for the longest time, it cost a fortune to get those books, and it took more time than I could possibly imagine to read them, because we're talking about a combined probably 200,000 pages worth of documents. All of that in 151 volumes is the official records of the War of the Rebellion, which some of us maladjusted geeks affectionately refer to as the OR. Okay, question over there.
Was the Santa Fe Trail kind of a conduit for Confederacy? I know El Monte was kind of supposedly the end of the Santa Fe Trail, but I was wondering if it was a relay point between
Not
Texas.
really. They did kind of go up some parts of the Santa Fe Trail, like when Sibley invaded New Mexico from Texas. But the Santa Fe Trail, runs through Santa Fe and then through the area that we kind of know as Las Vegas, and then it comes down to Southern California. Whereas the Union and Confederate armies mostly moved along what is today I-10 and I-40. Those are the routes that they took. And the reason why the Santa Fe Trail was not much of an option, specifically during the Civil War, is because there was a number of nations like the Comanches, the Navajo, the Apache, and the Mojave, and every one of them had a reason to be pissed off at Anglo-Americans. So during that time, the Santa Fe Trail was not much of a thing. Yes, ma'am.
I had a question about the spies, because I've had trouble finding sources. Most of the spy stories take place in more the Eastern theater and have more to do with military stuff. But can you talk a little bit about how the Union, how they worked and developed spy networks in California?
In California, the spy networks kind of developed themselves. The spy networks were active before any militia company joined the Confederacy, or before the Union Army really started organizing itself in Southern California. So as far as the pro-Confederate side, that was already some of the regular conspiring and intriguing that was happening within the Knights of the Golden Circle. But then, like the example of some of the letters that I shared with you, people just took it upon themselves to write information to the Union Army. And then people like Captain Bennett, before and during his time in the militia, he kind of built his own spy service. So he was recruiting members that he knew were members of a secession organization that he privately knew to be pro-Union men. He was using them to gain intelligence, and then it was the other way as well. You had members of the Knights of the Golden Circle sending lesser-known people to join the different Union clubs in the towns. So the spy networks really developed themselves, and then once the Army started working over here, the Knights of the Golden Circle stayed underground, whereas the Union Army spy networks kind of stayed in place. They never really came out into the open because people didn't want to reveal sources, but the pro-Union spies were plugged directly into correspondence with the Union Army, and the correspondence was happening on a regular basis.
So was Pinkerton active in California, do you know?
There were Pinkerton men that were active in California, but we're talking San Francisco and Stockton. So what they were really interested in, they were interested in protecting the gold fields, some of the government offices in that area, and then after 1864, the telegraph line, and then in 1865, the new transcontinental railroad, which was just about to connect Northern California with the rest of the continental United States. Okay, any final questions? Yes, ma'am.
In your research, did you see any reference to the Hellmans, or you just now was talking a little bit about the Big Four, perhaps with the transcontinental? I mean,
Not yet.
okay.
But it's probably going to be scarce to find information about those guys operating in Southern California, specifically during the 1860s. When the Big Four starts showing up is going to be late 1860s, early 1870s.
Well, the Hellmans were here in the 1850s.
The Hellmans might have been here, but their projects were not. At least not according to any of the primary sources that I've come across. If they were connected to the war, I really hope to find that out soon. Hopefully I'm able to find that stuff. I can tell you what I don't know, but I can't tell you what I know does not exist. Yes, sir.
I'm curious about the role of Albert Sidney Johnston. And I know that when he was in San Francisco as the head of the Army of the Pacific, there was a lot of concern when the war broke out and whether he had violated his oath as an army, of the Union Army, or betrayed, that oath. And you indicated that you thought he didn't in your presentation. He then came south, had the big party in LA that you referred to as well, and split off through El Monte out to the southwest with a band around him. So he already had a band around him at that time. So do you hold to the position that he actually did not violate his oath as a Union official?
I hold the position that he did not violate his oath while he was actively serving in the Union Army. And the concerns that you just talked about are the same things that were running through his mind. He knew that he was a very high-ranking official, and he knew that eyes were on him from all directions. He was actively pressured, constantly getting pressured by members of the Knights up in San Francisco to do something, especially to give them access to the federal arsenal at the Benicia Barracks. And he was very conscious of the fact that he was still serving in the United States uniform, so he was legally and ethically bound to be a steward of United States property. So instead of just arresting the secessionists per se, he didn't do that. So he was walking a fine line. But what he did do, for example, once he knew that the Knights wanted to raid the arsenal and then use those weapons to fight either a Confederate insurgency or a Pacific Republic insurgency, he had the weapons and ammo moved from the Benicia Barracks arsenal to have them temporarily stored on the island at Fort Alcatraz so that nobody could get to them. And then afterwards, once he found out that his replacement was on his way, he resigned his commission and then took off his uniform and traveled south. And then while he was traveling with the remnant of the Los Angeles Mounted Rifles, they passed Fort Yuma, and they passed a couple of other Union posts on the way, and the guys wanted to attack them because they wanted to get an early military victory for the South, but he advised them, no, don't do that. We have not yet been sworn into the Confederate States Army, so if we attack these posts right now, legally we will be pirates and we will be hanged if captured. So Johnston is the reason why those militiamen were on their best behavior until they reached Mesilla in Confederate Arizona, which is present-day Las Cruces, New Mexico. That was a good question.
That shows great integrity, I think, of Albert Sidney Johnston, that he would do, the way that he laid it out is what his duty was. And of course, he went on from there. It didn't take too long before he was killed at Shiloh.
Yeah, he was killed at Shiloh. And as a matter of fact, one thing I forgot to mention, Alonzo Ridley, who was former LA undersheriff, stayed with Johnston for the rest of Johnston's military career in life because Johnston was deeply impressed by this man. So Ridley was one of Johnston's staff officers, and then after Johnston was killed at Shiloh, then Ridley got himself transferred into the new Arizona Brigade because that was the farthest west and the closest unit to home.
So that's a very interesting thing just for Pasadenans in particular, because when he stayed with the Griffin family, his wife was Eliza Griffin Johnston, who was one of the original pioneers of Pasadena 10 years before the Indiana colony and other things like that. So his wife was a real pioneer in this area and actually had kind of the first home in this area that started the Fair Oaks Ranch.
Yep.
So there's a real important historical relevance to the Griffin
Absolutely. Mrs. Johnston's work is the namesake for the project for Fair Oaks Avenue. That project was the namesake for Fair Oaks Avenue. And there were other folks on both sides of the war who ended up building out this area of Southern California. Pasadena, as we know it, did not exist in the 1860s. But we know, for example, Owen Brown, John Brown's son, the only guy who survived the raid, ended up over here in the 1880s. But other folks came back from Confederate service. So, for example, former District Attorney of Los Angeles, Cameron Tom, who served in Virginia during the war and was wounded at Gettysburg, he came back in the late 1860s and he was elected DA again in 1869, and then he was elected mayor of Los Angeles either in 1880 or 1881 or 82. And that's really interesting too. California was not a rebelling state, so the 14th Amendment was a lot more liberally applied over here. So folks who had stayed over in the East Coast were ineligible to run for office for a lot longer, and in my opinion, they still were over here, but over here it was less of a problem, so it was easier for ex-Confederates to get back into government over here in California. All right, one final question. Anybody? Go on.
Tell us about your military service.
I was in the California State Guard for 9 years. I was still 18 years old when I got wavered in and started drilling. I wanted to join the regular services. I tried joining the regular Army, the Navy, the Marine Corps, but because I was born missing my right hand, that was a no-go. But the State Guard wavered me in because 70% of the California National Guard was deployed between Iraq, Afghanistan, and Kosovo, and they were desperate for boots on the ground to do garrison duty at the armories over here. So in 2007, they asked me if I had a pulse. I said yes. They wavered me in, and then I began my career as a reserve soldier. I like to tell myself that I was helping protect California from the terrorists, but I'm pretty sure all I did was protect Los Alamitos from Long Beach, or vice versa. And then I spent a few years on and off working as a military contractor, which is actually my day job today. So I work with the regular Army in a place, don't worry about what place, but we do a lot of training and mock battles. So I work as a linguist, and sometimes as a crisis actor, but mostly as a linguist and cultural interpreter in that particular capacity. So you might be wondering, what languages do I speak? Well, other than this one, I speak Spanish fluently. I have worked with special forces speaking Spanish, and I speak A2 level Russian and Ukrainian. Don't worry about why. All right, thank you very much.